I think we need to again restate what we're talking about with respect to the war in Israel to eradicate Hamas. Amid all the protests and all the punditry, which over the weekend was in large measure dominated by a discussion of what should or should not come after this war in terms of governance of Gaza. Can we just restate what we're talking about here? To help us, Dr. Kanta Ahmed, who's a physician who specializes in sleep disorders and a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. Why would she be relevant here? Well, because as she wrote over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal, I arrived on October 19th to spend 19 days as a human rights observer with the permission of the nation's Foreign Affairs Ministry and help from an IDF officer. As an observant Muslim, I felt a duty to come and bear witness. What I saw will remain with me forever. One word continually came to mind as she toured the morgues and hospitals, neonatal units, examined bodies and ashes, incinerated teeth and bones, saw toddlers, teens and adults, young and old, many of them bound, tortured, burned alive. One word continually came to mind, she writes: genocide. No matter how it emerges, the monster is easy to recognize. As a doctor, I had a rare and panoramic view of the aftermath, the targeted people's long, agonizing journey to death. It's not the first time I've seen Islamist jihadism or even Islamist genocide. I've been to northwest Pakistan and met child Taliban operatives groomed for suicide missions. I still attend to 9/11 first responders in New York. I've been to post-ISIS Iraq to meet with Kurdish and Yazidi survivors of genocide. I've spoken with former ISIS child soldiers and the Peshmerga veterans of the brutal and bloody 3-year war. The October 7th genocide was different, more barbaric than anything before it. The attacks were cloaked in the language and metaphors of Islam, yet corrupted with a cosmic enmity for the Jewish people, Judaism, global Jewry, and the Jewish state. They revealed again that Islamism is a virulent impostor of Islam with intentions anathema to the faith. And there was no doubt of Islamism's guilt. I saw real-time footage generated by the Hamas commandos' own cameras. I heard phone calls exclaiming the Islamic Declaration of Faith as they murdered, executed, burned, pillaged, and then broadcast their crimes. In conclusion, she writes, Islam, the West, and the Muslim world must respond with the necessary moral clarity. Define the October 7th attacks as genocide. Legally designating the horrors as such ought to become a priority independent of the war against Hamas, because the attacks need to be documented and prosecuted as crimes against humanity. Doing so is a matter of Jewish survival. The world has been silent in the face of Jewish genocide before. When we now say never again, we must mean it. So that needs to be entered into the evidence against the backdrop of all of these protestations that are going on in major Western cities. Of course, the ignorance that abounds on college campuses and the equivocations that come from so many political leaders, mainly on the left, but in the form of the icons of the left, like we discussed last week with Barack Obama's "everybody comes to the table with unclean hands" rap. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Caroline Glick. She's a senior contributing editor at Jewish News Syndicate, host of the Caroline Glick Show on JNS, and columnist for Newsweek. Caroline Glick, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on your program, Dan and Amy.
What has been, or continues to be, because we've spoken with you before, but what can, with another couple of weeks since the last time we spoke with you, what's your perspective and commentary on the cultural response to the Israeli defense over the last couple of weeks, cultural response in the West?
I'm actually looking aghast at what's happening in the West, what's happening on campuses, what's happening in the streets of cities in the United States and Europe. it shows that what we're facing here is a broad-based, deep annihilationist hatred of Jewish people, of the Jewish people, of the Jewish state, an increasing comfort level among people who you would consider to be right-thinking, but they're morally depraved when it comes to the Jews. The comfort level with the notion of genocide, of the Holocaust, of the disappearance of Jews from planet Earth. And that's, to me, I think that's a sort of I don't know what you call it, an aftershock of an earthquake that will reverberate for much longer than this earthquake. I mean, we are at war. We're making progress on the ground. And we'll defeat Hamas and perhaps Hezbollah as well, depending on how they behave in the north, and what we think we require in order to enable Jewish life in northern Israel. But I don't know what to think about the state of the West now and of Jews outside of Israel, given what we're looking at.
Well, I mean, the crowds are getting bigger. At London, they had 500,000 people, and I'm sure you saw the London Bridge. They were all over that, and then you had also, outside of Biden's Delaware home, and I don't know how they got there. That's not an easy place to get to with 1,000 people. But when do you think that they'll stop protesting? What exactly do you think that they want, just in order to stop this? Because it's every weekend now here in Chicago. It's every 2 to 3 times a week.
Right. So I think that what they expect is for the governments of the West to end their support for Israel and support Hamas. I think that's what they want, and Hezbollah, just as they support Hamas and Hezbollah. They're lobbying for genocide, They're rioting, they're terrorizing, they're intimidating, they're bullying for genocide. That's what they want. That's what they're after. That's what they're advocating on behalf of, and that's what they're pushing people to do. And I was very disheartened this morning to hear the news that they seem to be making headway in Britain, where I understand there are a lot of different clashes that have to do more with domestic politics than Jews. But you had the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who was the most outspoken critic of these mass rallies on behalf of Hamas and genocide. And she was very outspoken in criticizing these things. She called them hate marches, and stood very strongly with the Jewish community of England and with Israel. And she was just fired this morning by the Prime Minister after she wrote an article, apparently in the Times of London, reinstating her position against the pro-Hamas protesters on the street and criticizing the Metropolitan Police of London for enabling 500,000 people to be calling for the annihilation of Jews on the streets of London any day of the week, but particularly on Remembrance Day, which is Britain's Veterans Day for the veterans of the World Wars.
Well, that's interesting, too, because Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, had initially made a pretty strong statement in support of Israel. And now I'm sorry?
And he came to visit here as well.
Yeah. And now he seems, as you say, to be equivocating, which is not something that we're unfamiliar with, because that description, I think, properly applies to the Biden administration as well, including the former head of this administration, maybe the shadow head of it, Barack Obama, as I mentioned. But the statement that Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, made last week after his meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, where he said that the U.S., quote, remains committed to advancing equal measures of dignity and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. Now, on the face of it, you would say, well, we're just even-handed, that's sort of like an equal protection of the law type of statement. But do you read anything troubling into that statement?
I think it's very troubling. I think it's very, very troubling what the Secretary of State said. I actually discussed it at length in my podcast last week. If people want to check it out for a deeper discussion, but very briefly, we cannot have a situation where the Palestinians, who has a society both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza, greeted Hamas's acts of genocide in Israel with utter glee and continue to do so. And the Palestinian Authority, which is allied with and serving as the foreign ministry of Hamas today, and whose members wish to join the jihad against Israel and are expanding their attacks against Israelis in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. We cannot have these people not feel that they have been defeated. And what Tony Blinken is saying is, no. None of these people, not in Gaza, not anywhere, are going to pay a price of any kind for what happened. We're going to pretend that this isn't a society that's been mobilized to annihilate the Jews for the past 100 years. We're going to pretend this is just a couple thousand mass murderers that really have no public support of any kind. And we're going to say that Israel has to reward their society for spawning these monsters in its midst and all supporting them. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that Hamas is the most powerful force in Palestinian society here and all over the world. They are the unquestioned leaders of these people by everybody concerned. And yet here is the Biden administration saying, nope, not true. We're not going to look at it. And you have to reward them. You have to give them your land. You have to give them land that you have sovereign rights. You have to give them half your capital city, for crying out loud. Give them a state. Give them equal measure of dignity and freedom as you have, even though they've used everything that we've given them for the past 100 years to wage war against us. So the answer is absolutely not.
Well, and this goes to what I started the segment mentioning, which is this back and forth between Biden administration flacks like Jake from State Department, who is, as I've said before, he is a diplomat in the same way that Jake from State Farm is an actual insurance broker. But Jake from State Department, Blinken, others, absolutely, there's not going to be an Israeli. We don't support Israeli occupation of Gaza after the war and so on and so forth. I mean, all this stuff sounds very premature, but why we get into a public spat with a rather innocuous statement, in my view, from Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is, look, after the war, Israel is going to have military control of this until we can figure out what governance looks like that won't allow for another terrorist attack or ongoing open-ended terrorist attacks emanating from Gaza to occur. So I don't know exactly what that looks like now, but we're certainly not going to do all of this and then allow the Gaza Strip to be backfilled by the next generation of terrorists, which seems a reasonable position. So why the need to provide these clarifications and go back and forth between United States foreign diplomatic officials and the Israeli PM? I just don't see how that's productive.
I think that there are two reasons for it. One is ideological. You have a lot of very hardened anti-Israel ideologues who are in key positions in the administration. First and foremost, Hadi Yamar, who is the special representative to the Palestinians, and he has very long list of ties to Hamas from the time that he was in Doha. The Hamas's state sponsor in Qatar during the Trump administration, and he wrote a policy paper at the Brookings Institute in Doha, calling for the United States essentially to recognize Hamas as a legitimate entity and to change the terror laws to enable USAID to fund NGOs that were going to be working with Hamas and other things. So he has his sympathies, and so does Meir Bitar, who is the Director of Intelligence in the National Security Council, and others. And finally, there's the issue of politics. We're going into an election year. The presidential election is just a year away, and while the vast majority of Americans stand with Israel, all of the Americans, or almost a very large majority of the Americans who stand with Hamas are voters for Biden, and so there's an electoral calculus that they're making, that they have to keep these Hamas supporters on the left and in places like Michigan, where you have a very large and radical Muslim community on board. So I think it's both of those things.
Can you just clarify for us, because Rashida Tlaib, after she was censured last week, said from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And we've heard this, by the way, locally in Chicagoland, too, from some of these people.
Yeah.
They're now spinning this as, what that phrase means is not the annihilation of the Jewish people. It means peaceful coexistence. Is there any basis to support that claim?
Well, there's a good book that came out a couple of years ago called Everyone Loves Dead Jews by Dara Horn. She's a fantastic novelist out of New York. And I think that the title tells it all, because if there isn't a Jewish state and there is a Palestine that goes across Israel on the embers of the Jewish state of Israel, then the Jews that are going to be coexisting peacefully with the people who've just annihilated our country and the largest Jewish community on planet Earth are going to be loving the Jews that are dead, because that's what they want.
Caroline Glick, senior contributing editor at Jewish News Syndicate, host of the Caroline Glick Show on JNS, and a columnist for Newsweek as well. Caroline, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on your program. Have a good day.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
What if you could build a six-figure retirement income with almost half the money saved? You heard that right. Get a discount on your retirement, creating a six-figure income with 40% less than traditional 401ks and mutual funds. Hi, I'm Mitch Lyons, best-selling author and executive producer of a new Hollywood